Good morning, Dr. Franklin. My name is Ray Owens, and I'm affiliate assistant professor of ethics and Black church studies at Phillips Theological Seminary. I want to begin.
Ray, if you could just lean back, you're just kind of leaning into the movie.
That's
there you go. Carry on, sir.
My way. In 1968, the Kerner Report issued a sobering assessment of race relations in the United States, characterizing it as moving in a direction of two societies, one black, one white. 40 years later, would you provide us with your assessment of the progress that we've made toward the aim of creating one America?
Well, I have the feeling that it was about 1968 or in that decade that we began to move in another direction. The assessment of the Kerner Commission was, I think, accurate for that time. It is as though it might have snapped something and turned it in another direction. For that was about the last time that I think American society could be described as two separate entities, one black and one white. And although we were not going to achieve anything resembling equality for some years, this might have been the turning point. And surely within a decade or so after that, it could not be described as two separate societies in the way that it was described in the Kerner Commission report.
I'm John W. Franklin. My question to you would be, during the period you chaired the President Clinton's advisory board on race, you made your own assessment with your colleagues. What was your assessment at that time, late 90s, of the state of race relations in the United States?
My assessment, I think, reflected a discouragement brought on largely by the experiences of the commission itself and the attempt on the part of a fairly considerable number of American citizens to subvert the efforts that the President's Advisory Board undertook. As a matter of fact, it was sort of like an effort to sabotage the modest program of the commission.
Well, even though the political context was fraught with the president's own challenges at that time, you crossed the country with your team, and I thought you found some encouraging signs at the level of communities trying to make a difference in their own society.
Oh, we did. We found a number of encouraging signs. Perhaps the most important was the willingness on the part of large numbers of communities to open up the question and to examine it and to search for new ways of confronting the question. So that I think that the most encouraging experience that we had was the willingness on the part of many communities to look at the problem, to dissect it, and perhaps to make suggestions here and there for its amelioration.
Well, as you know, here in Tulsa, many of us are working very hard to create a space for dialogue across racial and ethnic lines, and much of what we're hoping to come out of this center that has been named after you has that as its focus. I wonder if you might comment on anything that you learned in your work as the chair of the President's Advisory Committee on Race that we can take and help us think about structuring our dialogue, structuring the work that goes on in this community.
There's, I think, a good deal that you can learn. Some of it is in the form of a warning. It is you must recognize the fact that there are people who are wanting to subvert any effort that you make to improve conditions, particularly between ethnic or racial groups, so that you must be on the alert for groups like that. In addition to that, I think that you would want to make certain that you have the machinery for recognizing promising experiences or opportunities that might lead to experiences, and that you will seize upon those opportunities and do everything you can to bring them into the picture, have them affecting developments as you go along. I am always heartened by the fact that once you get on a stream, once you get on a line, once you get in the path, so to speak, leading toward improvement, that you can find that path and go toward an improved condition maybe more rapidly than you might have anticipated.
What would you like to see happen in this center, the John Hope Center for Reconciliation? Is there anything specific that you would want to share with us that you'd like to see happen in that space?
Well, I would like to see several things happen. One is I would like to see an atmosphere created that would be tolerant and that would be understanding and that would be encouraging to groups and individuals that wanted to improve conditions among groups and individuals in this community. I yearn for that, and I believe that it's possible. And I think it's getting more and more possible as the days and weeks and months and years go by. This is not the Tulsa that I grew up in, certainly not. It's not the Tulsa to which I have returned in previous years. And it is the Tulsa that I think is improving with every passing year. I certainly would like to see that happen, and I believe it can be facilitated by something like the Reconciliation Center.
When you began working with President Clinton's initiative, Angela O, the Korean-American woman on the team, asked that the initiative go beyond the traditional black-white paradigm and look at America in all of its current diversity. While Oklahoma always had what we call now Latinos, as well as Native Americans, in addition to African Americans, how do you see the center facilitating dialogue across communities that don't necessarily converse?
Well, I do believe that the very existence of the center provides a stimulus and an opportunity for the groups, various groups, to come together and to react to each other in a way that would be constructive in the improvement of their general overall existence and in their relations with each other. I am one who believes that if you declare your objectives to be constructive, and if you then work to make those objectives real and feasible, possible, I think that you can improve the general conditions and the general relations of people significantly. And that can be done by working at it diligently, creatively, in every conceivable way. And I am persuaded that if you do that, conditions will improve.
Earlier this month, our nation elected its first African-American president. As a scholar of American history and as a leading expert in the area of race and race relations, we'd be honored to have you reflect on what that means for this nation, in your view.
It is difficult to reflect on the extent of an impact that such a development could have. You see, we have spent for the first 250 years of this country's existence making certain that there is a classification of races that places one above the other. And all that has been done legally as well as informally will have to be uprooted now, changed, in order to make it possible for us to move in a constructive way to improve conditions. That's going to take some time, and that's going to be extremely difficult. But that's just the pure logic and knowledge of what is out there. And until we recognize that fact, until we are willing to somehow to make certain that we understand what the task is before us, we're going to have great difficulty in confronting it.
One of the things I've always admired as I've read your work and heard you speak on a number of occasions is your ability to point to and highlight some of the major events in race relations in this nation, the highs and the lows. I've heard you do it a number of times. I wonder if you would share with us the three, maybe, events related to race relations that have occurred in your lifetime that you think are the major events in terms of shaping this issue and its solutions in the country.
Well, the first experience that Americans had after I was born in 1915 was a whole series of racial conflicts, riots, and violence of various kinds, various forms, that occurred in the first decade of my life, and that resulted in the death of hundreds of people and resulted in the injuring of untold numbers. And that resulted in the embitterment of large numbers of people on any side of the conflict that you want to point to. That's one of the major developments. Occurred all during the 1920s and into the 30s. I think another was the depression, the economic depression that came upon the country and that pervaded it for years on end, and that went into the 30s and 40s. That certainly had a profound effect. There didn't seem to be enough of anything to go around, and so it had the effect of enhancing or increasing discrimination, much of it racial discrimination. Then, of course, there was the the economic collapse of the country and of the world, really, in the very late 20s and early 30s, that brought about untold misery and suffering and privation and discrimination. Since there didn't seem to be enough of anything to go around, we tended to favor our friends and to discriminate against our enemies. And that created a whole set of problems of their own, and which complicated the solution of any of those problems.
One of the challenges I have faced working in the institution of Smithsonian, which has a range of people, when we're trying to create dialogue around issues of diversity, people who are already interested in the subject come. How do you reach the people who don't think it's necessary to be part of these discussions? The recalcitrants, the ones who think things are fine as they are, who aren't seeking progress. How do you seek to reach people who don't want to be part of the discussion?
One of the ways you reach them is to point to the unexpected, unanticipated, and remarkable changes that come about despite their indifference and sometimes opposition to changes and developments. If you see a person and say, this is a very exciting time to be alive because of this, that, and the other happening, and they said, well, what do you mean? What are you talking about? You say, well, the index for employment is up. The opportunities for providing sources of support for this group and that group have increased. And you point to the positive things that have happened despite the pessimism, despite even the opposition of some groups, that these things have happened. And if they open their eyes or raise their heads, they will see these things. And the moment they see them, they might begin to have a different attitude and to develop different ways of looking at the problems which they had been viewing for some times with indifference. Now they view them with some degree of hope and even optimism that they had not entertained before.
I have just sort of one final question, and this is really important one, a personal one for me. In fact, when I found out I was going to get a chance to talk to you, I made the time to read your autobiography, and I was, just finished it over the weekend. I was talking to some friends who asked me, one of whom asked me the question, well, what struck you most in reading it? And
in reading what?
in reading your autobiography.
Oh.
And my answer was that the thing that really struck me was what was missing from the autobiography. And what was missing in my mind is, given all that you've seen and experienced, given sort of that laundry list of experiences that you open up with, where you talk about the blind white woman who refused to allow you to help her across the street, and all those blatantly racist encounters.
Right here in Tulsa.
Right here in Tulsa.
It's a Tulsa story.
What was missing was rage, anger, bitterness. I didn't find that in the pages of the book, and I don't see it in your life. Where does that come from? What are you drawing on? I mean, you always seem to continue to be gracious and hopeful and positive. It seems to be clear in the book. What's the source of that? Where does that come from?
Well, you summing up a set of experiences which I've had and which are very instructive. That's the experience of having a mother and a father who did not bring to the task of living a bitterness, but a sweetness, an optimism and graciousness that I think found no place for hostility and for meanness and that sort of thing. My mother told me that I had no time for bitterness if I was going to try to improve my life, to say nothing of the lives of people around me, that I had no time for bitterness, that I had no time to lay out an agenda for hostility, and that was not very constructive anyway, and that the time that I took to do that, I could take and make a much better and a much richer life for myself and my fellows around me, and that I would live happily ever after, certainly happily in the knowable future, by focusing on things like that. So that I was admonished from the very beginning that I didn't have any time and I didn't have the energy to expend spewing hostility and meanness, but that I could take those very forces and convert them into something good and constructive, and I would be moving much more rapidly toward an existence that would be tolerable.
Thank you for the model that you provided.
For years, you've worked with students. For generations, you've worked with students. And I know you've learned much from your students, both undergraduate and graduate students. But the center must engage young people who have not seen the 20th century and the dynamics of race in the United States in the 20th century. What should the role of the center be with youth today and into the future?
Well, the center must be aware of what the students, the younger people have not seen, and must be willing to provide them with experiences which will which will expose them to the very things that they have not had before. And you take these experiences, plow them into the everyday lives of our young people, so that our young people will have an opportunity to confront the things that are constructive and that are instructive and that will, in a sense, improve their own lot and their own lives. I think that it's entirely possible for us to move from where we are, which is not terribly constructive and not terribly for the purpose of improving ourselves. We can move from where we are to where we want to be by turning our attention to the things that we know are good for us and that help us to improve our own conditions, and that will help us in our relations with other people. That's not as simple as it sounds, but it's very important that we develop these commitments or efforts, for if we do, we will make life easier for ourselves, and we will be moving toward the kind of constructive relationships with others that will make life easier in so many ways.
You've worked with a number of research centers in addition to universities. You've been part of the Salzburg seminars. You've been part of the Center for the Advancement Study of Behavioral Sciences. Since the center is to be a research facility and a think tank of sorts, what are the best aspects from these organizations, the Humanities Center in North Carolina? What are the best attributes of these institutions that you'd like to imbue this new center with?
Well, in the first place, the attribute of equality must be insisted upon for whatever we think are differences between you and me and among ourselves generally are not differences which will hold up in the face of an assault on people who are committed to equality. Therefore, I think it's very important that we recognize the fact that, after all, our future depends upon our commitment to a life of a willingness to exchange and to cooperate and to enjoy a human relationship that is fulfilling and that is constructive. And if we are in that mood or in that mode, I think that we will be much better prepared to move toward the kind of social relationships that will mean so much to all of us in the future. And so I believe it's very, very incumbent on all of us to be willing to look at ourselves, look at our fellows, look at our society, look at our institutions, and assess them for what they are. Some are good and need merely some trimming or some constructive amendments. Others are less prepared to face the future and therefore have to be done over, so to speak. But whatever they need, we must be prepared to address those needs and to improve them with a view to improving our social order generally.
Can I ask one thing? Are you gentlemen done, or do you think still thinking? I was thinking this would be nice to have.
Two more, but go ahead.
Well, go ahead. Well, your stories about Tulsa are especially interesting, about Tulsa as you knew it back in the 1920s. Could you, just so we get this on tape, expand upon what Tulsa was like for the people who will be watching this 10 years from now? They might be interested to know what Tulsa as a community was like in the 20s and 30s as you were growing up here. What were the dynamics happening here? And you can answer that, please, John.
Yesterday we spoke about growing up in Rentersville, which was a very small town, and with its own set of challenging relations among African Americans. When you moved to Tulsa in 1925, what kind of city did you experience?
First place, I was only 10 years old, and Tulsa was an enormous from the eyes of a 10-year-old who had lived in a city, in a community of less than 400 people. And that's one position we have to remember, that I was not prepared to take on Tulsa, so to speak. It was so overwhelming compared to what I had experienced before. And yet, here it was. And there were all kinds of things which impressed me. One was that even in 1925, more than 4 years after the race riot, there were few completed public buildings in the so-called Negro part of town. You had churches that, any number of, those are the most important public buildings in the black community. And these churches were almost all unfinished. They built out of the basement up to maybe the first floor, and that was the end of it. You saw it looked extraordinarily impressive that all these public buildings were half built. And I went around town looking for completed buildings. There were schools. Some of the schools were completed. Booker Washington School had not been destroyed in the first place. But some others had been inadvertently destroyed, I suppose. And then there were some other so-called clubs and public buildings that were destroyed or were affected. But that was one of the first things that impressed me. Another thing that impressed me was the fact that that you didn't have much in the way of change in these buildings as time went on. And I wondered why, and I realized that it was change that did not appear to be changed, but it took a long time to change the appearance of a public building, a public institution. That was why, and I could not, at 10 or 12 years old, I could not adjust to what changes were taking place because I could not see them in my juvenile perspective. I couldn't see them as changing rapidly enough so that I could cope with it and adjust my views and my judgments to it. But surely the most profound change that I witnessed was the change that came over me as a youngster, trying to cope with a society that was brand new, a society that was not particularly reflective of my view of life, and a society that was that showed a remarkable perspective of what I thought and had hoped would be constructive, but which I now was not certain about. Let me give you an example. That a big city, that's what I could not resist the description of Tulsa as, a big city, although it was certainly much less than 100,000 people at the time. but it was more than I could even encompass or take in. So it was a big city. And it was a city with people of all kinds, black and white and Latino and European and whatnot. I didn't think there was time or inclination to do anything about the problems that would affect a small community. These were big problems, big points to make in the relationship of people to each other. And when I became 12 years old, I became a Boy Scout, and that was all constructive from my point of view. You had to do one good deed every day, and you had all these elaborate and very generous relationships with people, and you were defined by your goodness and your constructive attitude toward life generally. And so I went around all that, when I became 12 and Boy Scout, I went around thinking that this is a wonderful world to live in, that all you had to do was to do good, be good, and that sort of thing. It came as a great surprise to me to find that that was not what everybody wanted. And I found that out in a remarkable way. I was a Boy Scout. I had to do one good deed every day. And I was about, one particular experience was that I was about 5 or 6 blocks from where we are talking now, many, many years later, 80, 90 years later. And I was waiting for a light to change in downtown Tulsa. And there were people fairly large, it was right in the heart of downtown. Fairly large number of people waiting for the light to change. When it did change, I, as a Boy Scout looking around to see what everybody was happy and everybody was doing all right, I noticed that there was one white woman who was trying to get off the curb, and she seemed to not known how far the curb was from the sidewalk where she was standing, and she then took her cane. That was one interesting, that she had a cane. She took a cane and felt her way down. Then I realized that the woman had poor sight, if she had any sight at all. And so I ran over to her, because this is my opportunity to do one good deed for the day. And I said, lady, may I help you across the street? She said, oh, yes, please do. I'm so glad. And she grabbed my arm, and we started across the street. And she was very cheerful. And we got out in the middle of the street, and she, for some reason, asked me if I were white or if I was colored. And I told her I was colored. She said, take your filthy hands off me. And what was I to do except to obey her command? So I took my hands. They might not have been filthy. I didn't think they were. But I took my hands off her and left her stranded in the streets. And I learned a great deal from that. Particularly that a blind person with prejudice can see filth which is a remarkable talent, and that a white person does not wish the assistance of a black person under any circumstances, even when the afflicted person is blind. I thought on that a long time. 80 years later, I continue to think about it and wonder whether or not we could move in the right direction with people whose head was clouded by thoughts and ideas like that. But that's the kind of experience that you have growing up in a society where the views of people, adults, are twisted and distorted in such a way as that. There was a long time before I fully recovered from the perspective which she had, which she sought to convey to me, and I'm not sure that I've recovered fully, even after all these years. But that's the process of learning as you grow up in a society that needs some reformation, and I have sought to give it some reformation, despite the fact that at the beginning and for some years I was unable to do it because I could not cope with the logic of people who felt it because you was of a certain color that you were also filthy.
We know lots about your relationship with your father, but I'd like you to first speak about what was your mother's world in Tulsa. I know she was a club woman. I know she was involved in National Council of Negro Women kind of organization. Can you describe her world and then describe your father's world?
My mother's world was of change. She was reforming herself. She was changing herself. She had been a school teacher. Having graduated from Roger Williams University, she'd gone back to her hometown, Brownsville, Tennessee, where she taught. Then she taught in Mississippi. And then she got married to my father, and they moved across the river to Oklahoma, where he had grown up. And it was now in the process of becoming a state, although it was not a state yet. It was become a state in 1907. They'd been married 3 or 4 years by that time. As a young woman in Tulsa, at first in Ardmore, and then in Springer, and then Ardmore, and then Tulsa. As a young woman, she was first not teaching, secondly having children. She had a daughter, and then she had a son, and then she had another daughter, and then finally she had me in 1915. And she couldn't teach. During that time, she had tried to teach when I was young, but without complete success, and she finally gave it up. But she was very resourceful and did a number of other things, including making hair pomade, hairdressing, and also making hats. You look in the directory in Ardmore, Oklahoma, you'll find Molly Franklin, milliner, which meant that she was a hat maker. She was very resourceful. She was also teaching, not merely as a public school teacher, but as a Sunday school teacher, and teacher of other areas as well. But as a teacher, and in a community where there was no daycare centers in Rennersville, and certainly not even after we moved to Tulsa. They were not in the daycare centers, so she took me to school when I was before I was school age. She took me when I was about 2, put me in the back of the room, gave me a paper, pencil, and told me to be quiet. And she then proceeded to teach the children. Well, what was my paper and pencil for except to do what the other children were doing with their papers and pencils? They were learning to read and to write, and so I was learning to read and to write too. And when my mother made the rounds of the room to see what students had produced on their papers, she looked at mine, and I had done what the other students had done, although I was less than 3 years old at the time. And so I was regarded as precocious from that point on, and I tried very hard to live up to my reputation as a precocious child.
I have this image of you when you were living in Tulsa. Your mother belonged to certain organizations, and they were going to have a luncheon. Your mother organized a luncheon. She'd prepared these plates, these salad plates, and had them in the refrigerator. And what happened?
Well, Mother came back to see about something in the kitchen. Just as she opened the door, I had the refrigerator door open and had my hand on one of the sliced peaches that was on the salad, and I was taking it out, and she said, "Go on and eat it. I'll take care of you later." And I began to cry because I knew what later meant, and so that was very distressing to me.
But what kind of organization was that she would have belonged to?
She was chairman of the board of the YWCA, and they were having a board of management meeting at the house. These experiences which were meaningful to me because. We didn't have an automobile, and the Y was too far for my mother to walk from our home. And she had to take a taxi, and almost every experience in those days was a new experience. So mother comes home in a taxi one day, just furious, and I asked her what was the trouble. She said, "Well, I've been trying to get a taxi to get home because I had to be home. But when they called the taxi, the white driver, when he saw I was going to be the passenger, he refused to take me. And they had then to finally find a black taxi driver that would take me and bring me. So I'm running late because of that. And it was all very confusing to me, but I remember that as an experience which she had when I was just a very young child.
And what was your father's world? By this time, of course, he was an attorney in Tulsa.
Yes, my father was an attorney in Tulsa. I admired him greatly. I thought he was just about as great as you could get to be, because he had an office away from home. He went to it every day. I didn't notice the fact that he was almost invariably alone at the office. But he was very busy reading or writing. Now and then he had a person there to talk to, or people there to talk to, but that was very unusual. And but I thought he was just something so very important, and I admired him. He was very, very gentle to me, as he was to most people. I never saw my father with his temper up. I almost never saw him with a threatening violence or anything like that. Extraordinarily peaceful man. He never touched me with a switch, or never whipped me, never punished me, anything like that. He later told me he couldn't bear that thought of punishing corporal punishment of a child of his. So he never whipped us. I couldn't say the same for my mother, who was prepared any and all times to chastise us in a very definite corporal fashion. But the world in which my father lived was something. I used to go down to his office after school. I would find him usually in his office reading or writing. Now and then there might be a person there, a client. But most of the time he would be alone. And I love that, because then he would invite me in to be with him, and I could talk with him, and he would explain things to me, and I got the feeling of that he was my companion, you see, and that was extremely rewarding. And I grew up admiring my father very much, wanting to be like he wanted to be. I never considered being anything other than a lawyer from the time I went to Tulsa in 1925 until I graduated from high school in 1931. I went to college bound, determined to be a lawyer. And I wanted to rush by college. They said I had to go to college. I wanted to go to college, and I go to law school, and I come back and practice with my father. That would be the thing to do.
Did you ever go with him to court?
Yes, I went with him to court, and he would, I didn't understand quite fully what his views were on race until I began to fathom what he was doing. He would bring me to the courthouse. We didn't have laws that segregated blacks and whites in the courtroom, as they did in some places, but not in Tulsa so far as I could see. But whites tended to sit one side of the courtroom, and blacks tended to sit on another side of the courtroom. I later learned that this was not by law, but by custom. And when I went with my father, I did not sit with the other people, the blacks who were already segregated, or the whites who had, who of course were segregated. They segregated themselves. He became an usher then, and either had me to sit at where a jury, if there was not a jury trial, we were in a courtroom, I could sit where one of the jurors would sit if there had been a jury trial, but there would be none. If there was a jury trial, he took me immediately up to the bar where he sat and sat down with me, although I'm just a kid in school. And then he would introduce me to the lawyers and to the judge. And they all took it as though that was a normal thing for him to do. But that was his way of protesting segregation, which he detested and would not tolerate it under any circumstances, and refused to be segregated himself, refused to have his children segregated. And so when I wanted to go to the opera, when the Chicago Civic Opera came down to town, and I wanted to go, it was unthinkable from his point of view because it was to be in Convention Hall, which is the area where he had been placed during the time of the riot. There was a detention center. It was the Convention Hall. And now I wanted to go there to the opera. He thought that was outrageous. I've never seen him temporize except on occasions like that. And I thought that one of my great triumphs of all times was to talk him into permitting me to go to the opera under those circumstances, which I succeeded in doing.
Well, I read in your autobiography that shortly after relocating to Tulsa, you and the entire family joined the church, Christ Temple CME?
Christ Temple CME Church, yes.
Talk a little bit about your impressions of religious life in Tulsa, North Tulsa, or even more broadly if you have thoughts on.
Well, of course, there was, we joined the church the very first Sunday we were in Tulsa. We got to Tulsa in December the 10th, and I think we joined the church that following Sunday. But I always had some problem with the brotherhood. These were brothers and sisters, and yet they were only black brothers and sisters, white brothers and sisters. We were in no relationship, even on Sunday, even in the churches. We were in no relationship with the whites. And that seemed to be very strange to me. That continues to be strange to me. And yet there we were. I found out also that although my father and mother had been very quick in joining the church, they were not very enthusiastic and not deeply committed, and it wasn't the highest thing on their social agenda, not high at all. They went to church, but there was no great commotion over it. They went to revivals and things like that, but not deeply committed, it seemed to me. And I remember that when I joined the church, I joined in Rennesville just before I left for Tulsa, literally a month before I left for Tulsa, at a revival. The name of the woman, evangelist, was Ms. Reverend Blake, Mary Blake. And she invited people who didn't belong in church to come down front. She would pray over them, and I went down. She prayed over me, and then she knew that I was leaving for Tulsa the next week, and she prayed that when I got to Tulsa that I would be safe in the arms of Jesus, and that I would be able to resist all temptations that would be surrounding me and whatnot. And she frightened me into joining the church, for I was seeking protection of some kind. So I joined the church, and so that was very nice, because when I got to Tulsa, I could go up with my father and mother, and my sister, younger sister. When they joined the church, I didn't have to stay behind and then be prayed over and that sort of thing. I could go up and be a member, just join like all the adults would join, although I was just coming on 11 years old. And so the church then became a place in our lives. We went to Sunday school. We went to the afternoon service up with League on Sunday afternoons, but it was not a big deal in my home, and you could take it or leave it. We took it most of the time, but when we left it, there was no great sin or anything like that.
I love the family story about when they arrived in Rentisville. This is, of course, before you were born, and your parents had been to Baptist institutions, and the city fathers, the day they arrived in Rentisville, said, "We didn't see you at church this morning," and they said it's because we attended the Methodist service, and you said that. They said, "Well, we don't trust Methodists." Didn't you go to Baptist institution? They said, "Well, you didn't have to be a Baptist to go to Baptist institution." And subsequently, because of the lack of trust, they didn't give him law work. They didn't give him legal work because he was a Methodist in a Baptist-controlled town.
Yeah, that's right.
So, thank you. It's been a wonderful interview. We could go on all day, but we don't have all day. But I really like your reflections on the center and what it can be. I think one of the things we need to look at is the relations between the center and other institutions.
Yes.
I know that it's Oklahoma State University and Langston are the initial university partners. But I think it would be interesting for all those involved to talk to the William Winter Center staff in Oxford, Mississippi, which is the only other center for reconciliation that I'm aware of.
I think it'll be known that, for the record, in any case, that William Winter was very active on the President's Advisory Board on Race. And I was chairman of the President's Advisory Board, and Bill Winter was the vice chairman. And so we worked together. He's the former governor of the state of Mississippi, and he and I worked together on the board from the time it came into existence until it went out of existence. And that he is still my oldest and closest friend in Mississippi. I was at the Center for Reconciliation at Ole Miss last year.
The last time I saw the governor, I asked him indeed if he would work with me at the Smithsonian, because the National African American Museum has as part of its mission to be a center for the discussion of race and reconciliation. And he said anytime I needed him, he's available to talk about planning, working on, and engaging in the reconciliation process. So I think that's very important for this center as well.
I'm sure he is. He will be available and valuable.
Great. Anything else? That seemed pretty comprehensive to me. I appreciate you letting me barge in there.
Sure.
What a treat.